Let's talk about the major events of the American Revolution, Part 3. We begin in the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence was not the only good document to come out of the Second Congressional Assembly in Philadelphia. The Articles of Confederation was drafted in 1777 and later ratified in 1781. The Articles accomplished several goals for the newly independent country. It addressed the issues of financing the war, gave power to negotiate treaties, and created a new form of government that included only one branch, a Congress, which included one representative from each of the former colonies. It avoided the creation of an executive branch. They were afraid of giving too much power to an executive. As complete as the Articles of Confederation seemed, there were many weaknesses that would eventually lead to their complete revision. This revision led us to the Constitution because the AOC was too far gone. Starting new would be easier. Back to the war at hand. Washington loses several battles before he lost New York City, a valuable stronghold in the north. It was burned, and though no one knew who started it, the blaze was blamed on the rebels. A man named Nathan Hale was captured by British soldiers and was accused of being a spy for Washington. The British general, that is, denied every decent request of Hale, a last meal, a Bible, and quickly put him to death. Hale's last words were those of a popular play that said, "I regret I have but one life to give for my country." The revolution had its first real martyr, someone who dies for a cause, as Washington is moving his troops into Pennsylvania for the winter. At Christmas 1777, Washington made his famous voyage across an icy and almost frozen over Delaware River into Trenton, New Jersey. Washington surprise attacked the British here and soon attacked and won at Princeton as well. These two victories, Trenton and Princeton, were encouraging to the rest of the colonies and were supposed to get the attention of the French and make them our ally. The French would need more convincing than just these little victories. In wintertime, when the rules of warfare said you don't fight. Washington, though, did gain the friendship of the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a young, 19-year-old French aristocrat, which is a noble, that was promised a job as minister to Paris, however, was laughed at when he presented his credentials to Congress. He couldn't go back to France because he had already came over, and that was against the wishes of his French king. I believe it's King Louis XVI. So he couldn't go back, so he enlisted as a volunteer in the army. By 20, he was riding beside Washington and was ranked as Major General. The Marquis de Lafayette was a valuable ally and friend to Washington. Now, Washington was hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania, getting his troops ready to settle down at Valley Forge. British General Burgoyne was on the move to Saratoga, New York, to help another British general, General Howe, against the rebels. Unfortunately, General Howe was heading to Philadelphia to try to catch Washington. Burgoyne's army moved too slowly and had too many supplies, eventually being trapped by the Americans, who signaled each other with a turkey gobble. Gunshots rang out, and soon Burgoyne had surrendered his massive army. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered 6,000 troops to the American army at Saratoga, giving the rebels their greatest victory to date in the Revolution. The French foreign minister was impressed with the Americans' ability to outlast the English and recommended to France that they become allies. Washington wrote in his journal that you could trace his men's tracks by the bloody footprints in the snow. His men were naked and starving. Some had to borrow pants to go out and stand watch through the night. This was a very harsh winter at Valley Forge. The Baron von Steuben, who lied on his resume, was recommended by Ben Franklin and hired by Washington to help train the troops at Valley Forge. Von Steuben was a Prussian. He began whipping the ragged, discouraged men into shape. They introduced the first vaccines for smallpox so the men would be stronger and healthier than their enemies. Suffering through frostbite, starvation, and dysentery, which is a sickness caused by bacteria from the toilets getting in their food, somehow, someway, the soldiers at Valley Forge were encouraged, proud, and ready to fight as a professional army in order to finish the war. Let's talk about John Paul Jones. If I could separate the pages. John Paul Jones is who we consider the founder of the modern Navy in the United States. John Paul Jones was a captain living in Virginia when the war broke out. He went to France and talked with Ben Franklin about his bold plan of attacking the British. John Paul Jones wanted to attack the British in their home waters. He wanted to take the fight to them. The French gave Jones a ship called the Bonhomme Richard, which is kind of a shot at Benjamin Franklin, by the way. It meant poor Richard. He began fighting with the British ship, the HMS Serapis. By the way, the HMS means His Majesty's ship. HMS Serapis. In this battle at sea, the Serapis maneuvered alongside the Bonhomme Richard, and the two opened fire on each other, side by side. The Bonhomme Richard was on fire, taking on water, and Jones was asked if he wanted to surrender. He famously said, "I have not yet begun to fight." Throughout the rest of this short battle, the Serapis seemed to have the advantage until Jones had his marksman climb up the mast and basically sniper kill the men on the Serapis deck, with clearing those men off the deck. Jones climbed aboard the Serapis and claimed the victory. Both ships were ultimately lost due to the massive amount of damage, and half of all the sailors died in battle. These victories and the words of John Paul Jones greatly encouraged the rebels to finish the fight. What about the battles in the South? At the Battle of Camden, South Carolina, Cornwallis scattered the South Carolinian and Virginian Minutemen in a shameful defeat. This was by far the worst defeat of the war. The South experienced the full measure of war, just like the North. It was not isolated to Boston or the rest of the North in Pennsylvania or New York. Loyalists and patriots fought for 2 years. However, Cornwallis found that he could overtake towns and he could win decisive battles, but he could not get information from the people. Cornwallis dominated the South. Other British generals, when faced with defeat, would run back to him and seek help and advice. Even still, Cornwallis grew tired of war, as most eventually do. He wrote, "I am quite tired of marching about the country. If we mean an offensive war in America, we must abandon New York and bring our whole force to Virginia." So you can see where his intentions were. In the summer of 1781, British troops were getting worn down in the South. It seemed they kept fighting and no decisive result ever came. Washington was getting ready to attack and overtake New York, which had been previously occupied by the British. Washington had the help of French General Rochambeau and 7,000 French soldiers. With the French establishing a stronghold at sea, Cornwallis's troops could not easily be resupplied for battle or escape, the French brought 28 warships into the Chesapeake Bay in full view of Cornwallis. He knew his time was short. In September of 1781, there was an inevitable loss. Washington had his command a combined French and American force of over 17,000 strong. This included Rochambeau's soldiers and two groups of colonists that included Lafayette's Virginians. Cornwallis was trapped on the York Peninsula, which juts out in the Chesapeake Bay. Lafayette assured Washington that Cornwallis could not escape. By this time, Lafayette and Washington had developed really a father-son relationship and were very close, and Washington could trust Lafayette. As Washington ordered the siege on Cornwallis, the Allied force quickly squeezed the life out of the British. Cornwallis was held up in the Virginia governor's house, who even told Washington to destroy it. Within weeks, the attempts from Cornwallis's rapidly reduced troops to return fire were weak. Washington was relentless in his bombardment because he could be. He had the resources to do so. Finally, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis and his troops surrendered unconditionally. His men marched out to lay down their weapons, and were quickly surrounded by the French cavalry. However, Cornwallis did not come out and surrender. He claimed he was ill, had a little scratch in his throat, I guess, and sent his second in command. Washington would not accept this surrender. He would only allow his second in command to accept this disrespectful surrender. When the news of Yorktown reached King George III, King George cried out, "Oh God, it's over!" Congress sent John Adams and John Jay to join Ben Franklin in Paris to negotiate the treaty. They were to be joined by Henry Lawrence, who had been held captive in the Tower of London, and upon his release learned of his son's death. His son was one of Washington's aides. Alexander Hamilton was the other, and eventually became mortal enemies with Thomas Jefferson over the types of government they should have. As peace talks dragged on, the eventual outcomes of the talks would greatly impact the future of America as we know it. The first thing, Britain had to recognize our independence. We are completely independent, free from all bondage of Britain. We are no longer associated in any way with Britain. And also, all of the territories that Britain had established in this new world are now ours. We extended our boundaries to Canada in the north, to the Mississippi River in the west, and to Florida in the south. After this war, the outcome doubled the size of the new nation. And it allowed for the eventual expansion and exponential growth the new nation could never fathom.